Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Bob Kaylor.
I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
And we are coming to you on Shrove Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, the day that Lent begins, but also it's known as Fat Tuesday.
Fat Tuesday. Here in Pennsylvania, we got Foshnocks, but where I was in New Orleans, I went to seminary in New Orleans, Baptist Theological Seminary, and they had a lot of great parades and fun things for Fat Tuesday.
What do Baptists do for Fat Tuesday?
Definitely not drink.
Yeah, we're having Foshnocks today.
Yeah.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
Sometimes we do, what was it, crab boils, the little, what are they called? The little...
Crawfish?
Crawfish, thank you.
Yeah.
You saved me.
Well, we always did pancakes or donuts or something. Something carbolicious is really what the day is about, but we're looking forward to that and looking forward to beginning the Lenten season with Ash Wednesday. We're also starting a new series on March 9th, the first Sunday of Lent.
Meant for good.
We're looking at the Joseph story, the end of Genesis, but we're wrapping up this week the origins part of Genesis, where we're talking about the Jacob story.
It was really, really rich. I absolutely love this passage where Jacob becomes Israel. God changes his name because he wrestled with God and yet survived.
I love this text because it's so random. Jacob lays down at night once again.
Yeah.
And we don't get any indication that this is a dream.
No, and it's interesting, both of these at night. And maybe it's a little bit of a precursor to the Joseph story, with Joseph interpreting his dreams.
Yeah, Joseph comes by it honestly. He's a dreamer. Jacob was a dreamer. But there's no sense that this wrestling match is actually a dream. It simply says Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him till daybreak.
Yeah, it's very, very...
It's one of those what kind of texts in the Bible? Why does this happen? Where does it come from? But clearly, whatever it was, an angel, God himself, an anthropomorphic idea of God coming in human person, there are a lot of different speculations about that. But whatever it was, Jacob believed that he went 15 rounds with God overnight. And when you put that in the context of what Jacob is doing, he's on his way to meet his brother Esau. It's kind of the inevitable meeting that they're going to have because of what's happened before. But a lot of years have passed in between here. And now Jacob's returning, and he's fearing for his life and really wondering, is that covenant promise that God made to me on my way to Haran now going to be activated on my way back?
It's fascinating, I think, about it's almost God preparing him to face Esau. And it's, if you can wrestle with God, who can't you wrestle with?
Yeah.
You know, it seems to be a really powerful time for Jacob to recognize who he is now. Not only was he bartering with God, now he's wrestling with God.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Yeah, well, you see you're right. You see the connection from the previous week where he's making a deal with God. If you do these things, then I will do these things. But now he's still making a deal to I won't let you go until you bless me. He's still making a deal.
That's right.
And that becomes a powerful image of grabbing on to God and not letting go. I was just reading in my devotions, we're part of the gospel reading in my daily devotions now. I'm in Luke, and Jesus is writing about persistence in prayer, where the woman who won't let the judge go until she gets the justice she's looking for. The man who keeps knocking on the door, asking for bread until the neighbor gets up and gives it to him. That sense of persistence. God invites that of us. But at the same time, God initiates it with us sometimes too. And so we talked about this image of God, the attacker.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, we so often think of God as nurturing and all those kinds of things, or even judging, but we don't think of God as necessarily attacking us. And I wondered how that landed with people, because that is not a usual image when we think about God.
No, I think it's really rich, and it makes a lot of sense. God is the God of all the universe, all things are underneath his power. And so we have a challenge put before us to respond. And God does that for our growth and for our good. But in the moment, it does not feel like that at all. In the moment when we feel attacked by God, it's very, very scary.
We often think that should happen when we're sinning, when we've done something wrong. But oftentimes it happens. It creates kind of a crisis moment for us where we have to really deal with God.
Yeah.
And
it's often in the deepest parts, in our deepest parts of the relationship, and the deepest parts of the longing and the need, the recognition for our need. That's where God will really work on us. I was thinking
about moments of wrestling in my own life, and they come frequently. I think one of those moments was actually during the pandemic. There was a statistic somewhere that said that, was it 38 or 44%? I can't remember the number. It depends on who you read. 38 or 44% of pastors considered quitting during the pandemic.
I remember. Was that Barna?
Yeah, I think it was a Barna thing. And man, I remember thinking to myself,
you can count me there.
I don't know if I want to do this anymore.
It was
because it was very difficult. We were getting it from both sides. No matter what decision you made, somebody was going to be angry. And I found myself at that point drawn, and I've mentioned this before, but I found myself drawn to Jeremiah, and particularly Jeremiah 19, where he's in that wrestling mode. He feels like God has attacked him. In fact, Jeremiah says, "You deceived me, and I was deceived." That's something interesting to say to God. You got me into this. If you know Jeremiah, God calls him there in Jeremiah chapter 1, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." So he was picked for this from the very beginning.
Wow.
And now he's in this, and he's talking to kings, and he's sending the king letters, and the king's tearing them into strips and throwing them in the fire. He winds up in a cistern. He gets beaten. He has all this stuff happen to him. He's known as the weeping prophet. And at one point there in Jeremiah 19, he cries out, I want to quit.
Yeah.
And yet there's something like a fire shut up in my bones, and I can't hold it in. That's what kept me going through that. But I felt like God saying, this is the tough stuff.
Yeah.
This is what I prepared you to do. Getting up every Sunday, preaching, have everybody file in, doing all that stuff, that's the normal routine that we do. And it's not easy, but it's the normal thing that we do.
Absolutely. The vast majority of those prophets are rejected at the time of their preaching.
Yeah, so this is not digging ditches.
No, this is hard
in
work.
that season, when there's high anxiety, so much comes around you at that point, and Jacob's dealing with high anxiety. Jesus is dealing with high anxiety in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think the parallel of those two passages is really, really important. And it gave me comfort to know that even Jesus was like, "Hey, is this really your will here? Is this really what you want me to do?"
Right.
Because I can walk down the valley here real fast and be out of this. Maybe there's some other way. What if I died in my sleep?
Wow.
Instead of dying on the cross.
I never thought about that. He sent his family across the river and he himself stayed by himself.
Jacob.
I wonder if that's what was happening.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, he's softening up Esau. He's hedging his bets to a degree. Jesus doesn't have a chance to do that. He's got to choose. And I think he does choose. I don't think that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is just working out a programmed script.
Right.
He's actually choosing in his humanness to go.
Exactly.
And he chooses to stay on the mat, to wrestle that all the way down, knowing how painful it was going to be.
Yeah, fully divine, fully man. And he is at this point of making that choice, to lay down his life for his friends.
Yeah, we're flipping back and forth between those texts, but I think they're so connected, which is why I connected them in the sermon, because I really do see that.
But personally, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say personally, my wrestling match with God, I mean, every time I have to make a large decision, whether it's a ministry move, whether it's a decision, the biggest decision of my life was, I mentioned at the top, going to seminary. I lived in New Jersey for the entire part of that entire section of my life. And moving down to New Orleans in 2012 was not something that I took not a decision made lightly. There was a lot of wrestling, but it was definitely one of those things that I recognized that if I don't do this, what am I going to miss out on? Because I know that God's hand is in this and he's on my life and he wants me to pursue ministry. And so, why New Orleans? God knew. I didn't know, but God knew.
I think everybody reaches that point in life where if they're really dealing with God, they're gonna wrestle.
Yeah.
If Jesus did, if Paul did, if Moses did, if David did, if Jacob did, you can just go on and on and on and see this. That's part of the struggle. But that's Israel. Israel is the name that God gives to Jacob, which means one who strives. And so he's looking for people who will strive with him. Yeah. I think God's inviting us into that struggle. Because if we treat God as a detached kind of deity, or we don't really see God being all that involved, God's not going to mess with us.
Right.
But if we're really engaged, God's going to say, let me discipline you a little bit. I think of it sort of like boot camp. When you go into the military, you're being shaped.
Oh, yeah.
You're being shaped by forces beyond your control.
Yes.
And they're shaping you in a particular way, and they're doing it through conflict. They're doing it through challenge. They're doing it through sweat and mud and all those kinds of things. I think the Christian life is a lot like that. To be resilient in the Christian life requires a certain amount of engagement with God on a very powerful, challenging level.
Yeah.
God reproves those he loves, says the psalmist.
Right.
And I think that's true.
Yeah, one of the richest things that I got from this past week in your sermon was that God picks on those he loves. And you don't mean that he's literally picking on us, but God definitely there's a reason why those who wrestle with God are in those wrestling, because deep cries out to deep. And the more we struggle, the more we strive, the more God is present and active with our life, because that is a sign of obedience. That is a sign of, I care about what you think, God. I care about what you want for my life. And God will be there if we invite him in, the ask, seek, and knock. And you mentioned it in Luke. The more we press, the more we ask, the more God is invited in.
I like the contrast and the comparison between Jacob's dream on the way to Haran and this one on the return trip. Because in the Stairway to Heaven piece, you have Jacob hearing God say, I'll be with you. It's this beautiful image of the angels going up and down the stairs. Here's this promise. And I'm going to be with you in the dark night of the soul and all of that.
Right.
I'm going to stand right beside you. And then you have this conflicted image on the other side on the way back after Jacob's experienced all this conflicted image. Now God is wrestling, God is challenging, God is pushing. I think those are two aspects of who God is. That God loves us enough to stand by us when we need stood and challenging us when we need challenged.
Yeah.
That's what shapes us. And because you can see Jacob being shaped as a person through this whole process.
Right.
And without that challenge, without that assurance on the one hand and challenge on the other, I don't think Jacob becomes the patriarch that he becomes. Now, let's be honest. We read the Jacob story, we're looking at someone and saying, does he really? I mean, he goes through all this stuff, has all these children. What kind of character does he have? He's not somebody who stands out and say, well, let's be like Jacob in all things, because he's not that sort of thing.
You got to think about context.
But he does produce Joseph, which is an exemplary character. I'm going to argue in this next series that Joseph is actually a typology, a sort of a template for kingship in Israel, for what rulers are. And then by extension, then a template for what the Messiah, Jesus, will look like.
Yeah. Well, we see Joseph rise in stature just as Jesus, as the scripture says, that Jesus did.
To go down and up and to be falsely accused. All those, there's so many parallels to that. But I think the story of Joseph speaks to us about how God is going to make things good. And one of the ways God is going to do that is through people. And one of the ways he does it through people is through both assurance and challenge.
Yeah.
Those are two aspects of God, just like God's grace and God's judgment are two aspects of God's character. With God, you rarely get either or. You usually get both and. And that's what's exciting and also challenging about faith.
Well, and the fact that Jacob walked with a limp for the rest of his life was a sign that he was one who had wrestled with God. That's a sign that he had endured these challenges, and it's a physical thing. But for us, whatever our struggles with, whatever our wrestling with, we can look at our scars, whether they're internal, external, whatever, and we can recognize that those scars actually created a beautiful story. If we're willing, if we're doing the work and we're wanting to walk with God, we can see the redeeming work that he is doing through those scars.
Leaders who are really walking with God almost always walk with a limp.
Yeah.
Figuratively, sometimes literally, but often figuratively. There is something that we carry with us.
Yeah.
If it's authentic, and it's best for us to acknowledge that when we do that, because I think that's what God intends for us. It's not our power. And the limp reminds us.
Yes.
Whatever that looks like, whether it's something from the past or something that we've experienced, or the hurt or the pain that we've gone through during a period of time. If you've done ministry for any period of time, if you've lived the Christian life for any period of time, you're going to have that sort of thing. And it's something you can look at and say, yes, that's painful. It's a reminder, but it's also indicative of the fact that I didn't do this in my own power. God was with me the whole time.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so necessary to be able to acknowledge it and be honest and authentic about those limps, those things that we recognize our scars, because those contribute to God's greater glory. It's not about us and what we've done and what we've accomplished. It's indicative of who God is and how he's blessed us through those scars.
Yeah, when I look at Paul, for example, in 2 Corinthians 11, when he's talking about all the things they went through to bring the gospel to the world, and seeing that as that suffering as indicative of not God's wrath, but rather God's presence in the midst of all of it. And I think that's one of the things that this story reminds me of, that when we're faced with a challenging circumstance, when we're faced with big decisions, when we're faced with confronting something from our past, like Jacob was, we have to be willing to stay in the mat. We have to stay on the mat, stay in the wrestling match with God until we wring that blessing out of him. To be persistent. God invites us to do that. It's not something we have to try to manufacture.
This reminds me of Jesus' hard teaching when he's talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And a lot of people walked away, and the disciples said, or he looked around at his disciples, "Are you going to desert me too?" And I think it was John said, "Only you have words of life.
Yeah.
Where else can I go?"
I think it's Peter, but
Peter.
Yeah, he says, where else can we go? Where else can we go? We've got to stay here. We're in this. We're in it for good. And we recognize that whatever's happening ultimately is for our good and for the good of all creation. And that's the Joseph story, really, that we're going to be getting into.
So rich.
That's why we're titling it Meant for Good, because Joseph is going to make that realization that what God intended from the beginning is going to be good in the end, but it's going to be good because people are going to strive with God for that purpose and recognize where God is at work, recognize where their limits end and where God's power begins. That's where we need to be in our lives, is always recognizing that limitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so similar to what you're talking about. So what advice would you give for somebody who might be wrestling with a call from God or a move of God?
I think one of the things that we often don't do is take time to do discernment. What is God actually calling me here to? Where's the lesson in the midst of this? And I go back to this over and over again, but I think journaling for me has been really helpful for that.
Yeah.
I was just looking back through my journal during that COVID period and realizing that, man, I was pouring a lot of stuff out. It was a lot of self-pity, to be honest.
Well, and a lot of it is. I mean, that's where you're at right now.
It was a lot of self-pity. Woe is me. How terrible is this? It's very Jobian, if you will.
Oh, listen, we all have a right to lick our wounds.
Yeah.
Right? We have to get up, but
at the same time, realizing now on the other side of it, God used that time to make me a better leader. God used that time to make me more resilient, to really solidify my call, because it would be easy to walk away and say, well, this is just too hard. I want to go do something else. But God really used that time to make me a better pastor and a better person and a better leader and all of those things. The pain was worth the process to do that.
Yeah.
And I didn't ask for it. And I don't think God visited that on us, but I do think God used it, which is really the point. And that's the point of the Joseph story. God uses these things for good if we're willing to lean into that and stick with it.
Exactly. You said stay in the ring. Don't go away from that wrestling. Don't think that you're just going to send yourself out and quit and give up, because the moment that happens, then we lose a lot. We lose a lot by just not being willing to challenge ourselves in that way.
We said last week that one of the things we have to do is surrender to recognize the things we can control and recognize the things that we can't. But I said then, surrender does not mean giving up.
Right.
And I think that's true here too. God invites us to continue to struggle. Jacob struggles till daybreak. And even then he says, I won't let go until you bless me. I won't let go. God, I'm not going to let go of you. I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to keep asking. I'm going to keep pushing until I receive that blessing. It may not be what I expected. It probably won't be. It may not be what I want necessarily.
Right.
But it's going to be what's best if I stay with it. So I just want to encourage you, if you are dealing with something that is really wrestling hard in your life, I want to encourage you to stay with it and just be willing to go to God in prayer. And I mean, not just, oh, dear Lord, let me bow my head and fold my hand and close my eyes and be formalized at prayer. Let him have it. God's ready for it.
Oh,
let him have
no
it.
doubt.
And let him have it. Jesus says God invites that for us. And the psalmists tell us that God invites that. Go to the mat.
Yeah.
Wrestle hard till you receive that blessing that God wants to give you. And this is not prosperity gospel junk or any of that. This is just what kind of good is going to come from this if I stay with it.
Yeah.
And I just want to encourage you to do that.
And I just say, breathe, and just remind yourself that whatever circumstances you're facing, even if they're physical limitations, you can breathe and just be present in that moment and just recognize that God's grace is with you no matter where you are.
There's a lot to this passage, and we want to make sure that you have a chance to go back and listen to the sermon, and you can do that on our YouTube page. And we start our new series this week. As always, we want to remind you that for this upcoming series, we've created a series of study guides that are available on our website.
Yeah, you can go to aldersgateyork.com/ment-for-good, and that's where you'll find the series. And it'll also be on the top page. You can just go to groups, and it'll be right on the first.
And you can get together with some friends or just go through the discussion questions yourself and enjoy diving into this great story of Joseph, which is one of the most redemptive stories in all of the Bible, I think in all of human history. And it will really be transformative for you, and we encourage you to do that.
Very excited.
And we have Ash Wednesday coming up.
That's right. Tomorrow.
This week. Yeah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow night, 7 p.m., Sanctuary.
And we'll come with Imposition of Ashes and start the Lenten season by reminding everybody that they're going to die.
That's right.
Always a great way to start the Lenten season. But it's important because we recognize this is one of the reasons why that wrestling is so important.
Humbling experience.
We have time. We have to use the time, redeem the time. And that's who we're about, and to really grow closer to God. And I think that's what the Lenten season really invites us to do, is to dive in deeper with God and really do that wrestling in our own souls. Well, thanks for joining us in this episode of the Aldersgate Experience. We'll be back again next week. as we dive into the Joseph story.
That's right. You can send your questions to communications@aldersgateyork.com. And you can also check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/aldersgateyork.
We'll see you next week.